to opposition from Belgium's Prime Minister. EU High Representative Kaja Kallas said a reparations loan for Ukraine would not derail the peace process.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz welcomed Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk for defense cooperation talks in Berlin on Monday.
Tens of thousands of Bulgarians staged protests in Sofia to oppose the government's budget draft for next year in what was the biggest demonstration in the country in decades.
In a response to Belgium's Prime Minister Bart De Wever, EU High Representative Kaja Kallas said approving a reparations loan for Ukraine gives the European Union greater leverage at the negotiating table to end Russia's war. De Wever had previously warned that the proposal risked derailing the diplomatic process. Kallas, however, insisted that the approval of the reparations loan sends three messages. To Ukraine, she argued it would show them that the EU is there to help defend themselves. Secondly, it would send a message to Moscow that they can't outlast the EU. And finally, it would prove to the US that the EU is taking strong and credible steps. Under the scheme, the bloc would channel the frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Kyiv would only be asked to repay the loan if Moscow agreed to compensate for the damages. However, Belgium's Prime Minister Bart De Wever has repeatedly opposed the proposal. He claims it could pose a risk to Belgium, where the assets are stored. He also said it could act as an obstacle to the White House trying to reach a deal between Ukraine and Russia.
Chancellor Friedrich Merz welcomed Prime Minister Donald Tusk for the 17th German-Polish government talks in Berlin on Monday. The meeting comes after EU foreign and defense ministers met in Brussels and as Poland seeks to deter Moscow's recent provocations. Warsaw wants to foster stronger relations with Berlin, but there is also mistrust. However, Chancellor Merz emphasized the importance of solidarity.
Gerade in diesen Zeiten, in denen die Einheit Europas so unter Druck steht, dürfen wir uns nicht auseinander dividieren lassen. Wir müssen und wir werden zusammenstehen.
But Poland expert Dr. Kai Olaf Lang describes German-Polish relations as paradoxical.
Kann denn das Treffen zwischen Donald Tusk und Friedrich Merz an diesem Misstrauen etwas ändern?
Es gab eben auch innenpolitische Bremsfaktoren, sodass man aus deutscher Sicht, glaube ich, das Gefühl hatte, Polen macht eine Deutschlandpolitik mit angezogener Handbremse.
According to Dr. Lang, Poland sees itself as the regional power in Eastern and Central Europe and wants to be treated as such.
Zabrało mi trochę czasu przez ostatnie lata, aby przekonać naszych niemieckich partnerów do tego, aby bezpieczeństwo w tej części Europy traktować jako wspólne zadanie.
As the government in Warsaw seeks more direct cooperation on security issues, the reality on the ground seems to be different.
In Polen wiederum hat sich der Eindruck vertieft, Deutschland habe zwar eine Rhetorik der Einbindung und der Aufwertung Polens, aber wenn es dann wirklich drauf ankomme, dann werde Polen eben nicht berücksichtigt.
Can this paradoxical situation develop into a strong German-Polish security partnership in the future?
Laut dem deutsch-polnischen Barometer zeigt nur ein Drittel der Polen Sympathie für seine Nachbarn in Deutschland. Und das dürfte nicht nur an den Reparationsforderungen liegen. Polen will mehr Mitspracherecht in Sicherheitsfragen. Zuletzt wurde der US-Ukraine-Friedensplan über die Köpfe der Polen hinweg diskutiert, inklusive des Punktes 9 mit der Stationierung europäischer Kampfjets auf polnischem Gebiet. Heute macht der polnische Ministerpräsident Donald Tusk deutlich, Entscheidungen über die Sicherheit in Europa dürfen nicht über Polen hinweg entschieden werden. Und der deutsche Bundeskanzler Friedrich Merz muss nun beweisen, dass er Polen als strategischen Sicherheitspartner ernst nimmt. Diana Resnick aus Berlin für Euronews.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron in Paris to discuss the US-authored peace deal, a deal that has been criticized for being too weighted towards Russian demands. Zelensky warned on Monday that Russia should not profit from the invasion of Ukraine, and Macron on his end underlined that no agreement will move forward without European participation.
Тому ми займаємо принципові позиції щодо санкцій, і щодо відповідальності за злочини війни, щодо юридичного статусу наших територій, які зараз займають російські окупаційні війська, і щодо російських активів, і щодо обов'язку реконструкції. Агресор повинен платити за агресію.
Pour le reste, il n'y a pas aujourd'hui à proprement parler un plan qui soit finalisé. Sur la question des territoires, il ne peut être finalisé que par le président Zelensky. Sur la question des actifs gelés, des garanties de sécurité, de l'accession à l'Union européenne, des sanctions européennes, il ne peut être finalisé qu'avec les Européens autour de la table.
Over the weekend, a Ukrainian delegation met with U.S. officials to discuss the peace deal. According to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the meeting had been productive. The latest round of talks comes at a challenging time for Kyiv, as Russian forces continue to gain ground in eastern Ukraine, and Zelensky is facing strain following a domestic corruption scandal.
In an interview with Euronews' New Morning Show Europe today, General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, speaking on the war in Ukraine and Europe's safety, warned that the continent is slowly waking to the realization that it cannot count on Washington as a fair partner.
I think Europe and Ukraine, including Ukraine, knows that the United States has a primary interest, which is business with Russia after this is all concluded.
In the general's view, the US administration's approach to the conflict was flawed from the start.
The administration's approach has always been doomed from the start because they didn't care about the origin, they didn't care about the history or the geography involved, and in fact approached it as a massive real estate deal. So, Secretary Rubio said in the beginning, Ukraine, you're going to have to give up some territory here before they even started.
This week, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will skip a key NATO meeting, highlighting Europe's decreasing priority for the US after the Western Hemisphere, Indo-Pacific and likely the Middle East, according to Hodges. But the general remains confident that Europe has the capabilities to defeat Russia's war in Ukraine.
If you add together the industry, the wealth, the populations, the technologies, there's no reason that Europe, including Ukraine, cannot stop Russia. What they lack is the self-confidence and the political will.
According to Hodges, the narrative that Ukraine is losing the war doesn't add up, as Russia's economy is in deep trouble, and in 11 years, Russia has only been able to occupy 20% of Ukrainian territory.
Tens of thousands of protesters gathered in the Bulgarian capital Sofia to voice their objection to the government's budget draft for next year in what turned out to be the biggest protest in the country in decades. The demonstration was dominated by young people and was planned to be peaceful in nature. Protesters chanted resignation as they demanded the incumbent coalition, led by the Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria party, known as GERB, to revise the draft or step down. Protesters also called for the prosecution of two key players in the ruling coalition, GERB leader Boyko Borisov and the Movement for Rights and Freedoms leader Delian Pivsky. But a small group of masked people incited chaos outside the headquarters of those parties, throwing chairs at the buildings and police officers guarding them, as well as glass bottles. Footage showed clashes between the masked individuals and police forces, with garbage dumpsters being set on fire and police vehicles vandalized as chaos quickly unraveled. Protesters say those who incited violence were not part of the rallies, accusing them of being hired to provoke and undermine the demonstrations. On the 27th of November, the government announced it was withdrawing its controversial budget plan, which aimed to steeply increase taxes following domestic pressure and a night of protests. Borisov later rescinded the withdrawal, instead promising changes to the draft, which he said would be implemented by the first or second parliamentary vote, prompting the organization of a second rally. Protesters are worried the proposed budget, along with major imminent shifts, like Bulgaria's adoption of the euro in January, could lead to economic instability.
The White House said on Monday that the Navy admiral acted within his authority and the law when he ordered a second follow-up strike on an alleged drug boat in the Caribbean Sea in September. According to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, Defense Secretary Exeth authorized Admiral Bradley to conduct these kinetic strikes. Leavitt, in her comments to reporters, did not dispute a Washington Post report that there were survivors after the initial strike. Her explanation came after the report detailing the attack sparked controversy, and President Donald Trump said he wouldn't have wanted a second strike when asked about the incident. The controversial September strike was one in a series carried out by the U.S. military in the Caribbean Sea and Eastern Pacific Ocean, as Trump ordered the buildup of a fleet of warships near Venezuela, including the largest U.S. aircraft carrier. More than 80 people have been killed in the strikes that Washington says targets drug cartels.
Nicola Pietrangeli, the Italian tennis champion of the 1950s and 60s, has died at the age of 92 on Monday, according to the Italian Tennis and Paddle Federation. Pietrangeli was the first Italian player to win a Grand Slam trophy, triumphing at the French Open in 1959. He was also captain of the national team that claimed the Davis Cup in 1976 and reached the semi-finals at Wimbledon in 1960.